Good morning, girls. Today we are continuing in our study in Galatians of Peter's defense of the gospel. Before I get started on that, though, I want to just set it up with a quick question. If you know the meaning of the term called on the carpet, and if you've ever actually been called on the carpet. I was asking that question yesterday, and it was interesting to get the responses of several of the women who had been in situations, maybe at work or in some other setting where they were called out for something. And it made for some lively exchanges. And so today, the reason I asked that question is because today we're dealing with the situation in Galatians where Paul called Peter on the carpet and really confronted him. And the reason is Paul is just adamant and very passionate about the purity of the gospel in Christ and Christ alone. That's what we have been seeing as we worked through chapter 1 and now chapter 2, throughout his passion for keeping the gospel message in its purity, that it is only through faith in Christ by the mercy of God. It has nothing to do with anything that we can do to gain salvation, nor to keep salvation, to impress God. And so that is, again, the topic today. And I would imagine it's going to continue to be the topic through the entire book of Galatians, if I were to give a guess. So in chapter 1, Paul was very clear in his belief that these false teachers that had come to Galatia, to those churches that he had begun, after he left, these false teachers came in and said, no, you've got to also, in addition to asking Jesus into your life, you've got to keep the Jewish traditions of circumcision and eating kosher. And Paul said, no, you do not. And if you do teach that, you are, he used a strong word. He said, you are damned for having teaching that kind of perspective on Christianity. And so here he is again, defending his position, but it's in an interesting way this time. There evidently was an actual face-to-face confrontation that we're going to read about. Now, I am going to read to you from the ESV as well as the Message, because I have so appreciated Peterson's paraphrase of the Bible, because it just really speaks in a way that is very comfortable and informative to us today. He uses a modern version that is just very easy for us to understand. So that's what I'm going to do. Starting with the English Standard Version in Galatians 2, verse 11, I want to read just 3 verses, and then we'll go back and read 3 verses from the Message. Galatians 2, verse 11. But when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. All right, so let's just take them one verse at a time, and as I read the Message, and then we will discuss it. So back to chapter 2, verse 11, in the Message. Later, when Peter came to Antioch, I had a face-to-face confrontation with him because he was clearly out of line. So let's talk about Antioch. Antioch is the city where believers were first called Christians. It was kind of the base of operations for Paul's ministry alongside Barnabas. And at some point in the history of the church, as Barnabas was the pastor of one of the churches there, and I know that he traveled with Paul a lot, but at some point in that time he was pastoring a church in Antioch. So the believers in Antioch were solidly taught. They had a firm foundation on the truth of the gospel, the purity of the gospel that comes by faith in Jesus Christ's work on this cross, and not anything that we can do, not any works that we can do. And so they know better than what has been happening in Galatia. They were having wonderful growth there in the faith, and they knew that they were not required to be circumcised or eat kosher. And so when Paul shows up in Antioch, Peter is there, and Paul is going to oppose him to his face, a face-to-face confrontation. Now, it also says that he stood condemned. Peter stood condemned. John MacArthur on that says that Peter was not condemned in the sense of losing his salvation, but in the sense of being guilty of sin by taking a position that he knew was wrong. He no doubt had stood condemned as a sinner in the eyes of the Gentile believers in Antioch because they were well grounded in the grace of the gospel, were perplexed and deeply hurt by his ostracism of them. So stood condemned, we hear that word, and we know that Romans 8 verse 1 tells us that there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And so we wonder why Paul is saying that Peter stood condemned, but it's really just a statement of the fact that Peter was knowingly and willfully sinning. Okay, then verse 12 that we've already read in the English Standard, I'm going to read it now in the Message. Here's the situation. Earlier, before certain persons had come from James, Peter regularly ate with the non-Jews. But when that conservative group came from Jerusalem, he cautiously pulled back and put as much distance as he could manage between himself and his non-Jewish friends. That's how fearful he was of the conservative Jewish clique that's been pushing the old system of circumcision. Now, I really like the Message here because it really does paint a very clear picture of the setting and what Peter is actually doing. Now, when it mentions in the conservative party or the circumcision party, it's the same thing. This bunch came to Antioch to check on things. Now, there was the Christians in Antioch who were Gentile Christians. They held a potluck dinner for the visitors, and it may have even ended in sharing the Lord's Supper together. But it was a very important meal that they were sharing together. The Greek doesn't communicate as much as we see here as it's translated into English. It simply says that they were eating together. Now, that isn't a random experience of eating to get nourishment. It was deep fellowship with people you love. These church dinners were a regular affair for the purpose of spending quality time with people you love in the Lord and are intentional for building relationships. They were actually called agape feasts. Well, what is agape? Love, the love of God. So they were called love feasts. And the way the text reads in verse 12, it seems that these believers in Antioch and Peter were friends and had eaten together before this particular event. But Peter was intimidated by the visitors from Jerusalem. He feared their judgment of him, sharing a non-kosher meal with Gentiles, so he snubbed them to eat with the big shots from headquarters. He held himself aloof. What does that statement communicate to you? Well, to me, it's almost like he looked down on them. People that he had been so cozy with before, but when these other Jerusalem people come, they're kind of beneath him, which is a scary thought for such a well-known Christian to do that. And so it's almost as though they may have, the Gentile Christians in Antioch may have taken this snub from Peter as him just saying, you really aren't actually saved. Or maybe you are, but you're not legitimate in the eyes of these guys from Jerusalem. So very harsh thing that Peter did. But Paul, as is typical, is calling Peter out for it. He mentions here, and I'm reading it now from verse 13 in the Message, unfortunately, the rest of the Jews in the Antioch church joined in that hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was swept along in the charade. Peter, after all, has a reputation to uphold. I would guess that he's most likely the most well-known Christian in the world at this point. He's the first person to preach at the day of Pentecost. He's the first person to lead thousands of people to Christ. So he was probably pretty well known. And he has a very widely known reputation. Not only does Peter have quite the reputation as a leader, what else do we know about Peter's temperament and his interactions with Jesus during the 3 years that makes us say, yeah, I could see this coming? Well, he's impetuous. We've got Peter at the transfiguration of Jesus speaking up so boldly and saying, let's build us some tents and hang out up here. We've got Peter saying, Jesus, I'm ready to die for you. We've got Peter cutting off the ear of a soldier. We've got Peter's denial of Christ. We've got Peter's impetuously jumping out of the boat when he sees Jesus on the shoreline after the resurrection. And so Peter is one of those people that, reacts quickly and doesn't think. Great leader of the church. But we can kind of see that people who put themselves out there as leaders and are, kind of larger than life personalities, well, they're sometimes going to mess up, as we all do. And one of the outcomes of this is that actually Barnabas, bless his sweetheart, was drawn away by the same kind of hypocrisy. And Paul clearly calls it hypocrisy. In the Message, they called it a charade, but it means the same thing. Now, going on further, let's read 3 more verses in the ESV. But when I saw their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners. Yet we know that a person is not justified by the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified. Now, what I want you to notice here is that Paul is making a little transition here. In verse 14, when he says, when I saw the conduct, and I said to Peter, but then in verse 15, he says, we who are Jews by birth, and we know, verse 16, we know that a person is not justified by the law. So it appears to me that in 15, he's transitioning from his face-to-face assault on Peter to 15 and 16, including Peter in drawing Peter into agreement that he has been wrong and saying, Peter, I know you know better. And I love this. Because Paul's brutal in his assault here, in front of public dressing down in front of people. But I think it needed to be public because they had been shunned publicly. And so because Peter had shunned them publicly and embarrassed them and belittled and looked down on them in a public setting, it is appropriate that Paul did his confrontation in a public manner. But now we see him in 15 and 16. It's like, okay, I'm done pointing out your fault. Let's see what we agree on. And he does that beautifully as he begins to say, we Jews, and we know, this is what we have taught, including you, Peter. I know that you know this. All right, so he says in this statement, in verse 14, in the Message it says, but when I saw that they were not maintaining a steady, straight course according to the Message, I spoke up to Peter in front of them all. If you, a Jew, live like a non-Jew when you're not being observed by the watchdogs from Jerusalem, don't you love that? What right do you have to require non-Jews to conform to Jewish customs just to make a favorable impression on your old Jerusalem cronies? Peter is just so busted. His pride made him want to impress the big shots from Jerusalem, the watchdogs, the cronies. And so Paul is calling him out on that, but then that transition in verse 15, according to the Message, we Jews know that we have no advantage of birth over non-Jewish sinners. Quickly, just I mentioned, Paul's kind of tongue-in-cheek when he says non-Jewish sinners here in the Message. It's in quotes. In the ESV, it is not in quotes, but he says Gentile sinners. So it's tongue-in-cheek, but Paul knows very well that all of us are sinners. Jews that became believers in Jesus Christ and followers of Jesus, they were sinners as well as the Gentiles. But it was a very common thing in that day and time throughout the Old Testament and even during the time of the New Testament and the beginning of the church. It would not have been uncommon for a Jewish person to use the word sinner alongside the word Gentile. And so that's, again, Paul acknowledging that, he knows that Peter's background's the same as his when it comes to Gentiles. But he also knows that, hey, Peter, you are the very one that God sent that sheet to that had that vision of all kinds of unclean animals and a command to rise up and kill and eat those unclean animals for nutrition, because there was no longer any need for any kind of kosher rituals. Jesus had come. Jesus had fulfilled all of those laws in his own body, and there was no need for a person to keep themselves ceremonially pure because Jesus had come. Jesus was their cleanliness. Jesus, when we invite Jesus into our temple, our body, then he does the purifying. He does the cleaning up. There's no ritual that can provide that. And so he goes on in the message in verse 16, he says, "We know very well that we are not set right with God by rule keeping, but only through personal faith in Jesus Christ." How do we know? We tried it, and we had the best system of rules the world had ever seen. Convinced that no human being can please God by self-improvement, we believed in Jesus as the Messiah so that we might be set right before God by trusting in the Messiah, not by trying to be God. You see here, Paul is just really giving us a beautiful explanation of the gospel and the idea of justification. And it clearly uses the word justified in the ESV at the end of verse 16, where he says, "We have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by the works of the law no one will be justified." Okay? No one will be justified. In the message, it says no one will be set right before God. And that is a easier description of what justified means. That Christ justifies us. His death on the cross justifies us. It sets us right with God. Because we are sinners by birth, by nature, spiritually dead in our trespasses and sins, according to Ephesians 2. And so we cannot fix our dead spiritual condition by being good. The only thing that can fix a dead spiritual condition is the life of Jesus Christ entering into a person, into their soul, into their spirit, and making it come alive. And that is what brings justification. That is how we are made right with God. I know that there are a lot of great illustrations that people have used in explaining salvation to people through the years. And there are probably things coming to your mind. One that came to my mind that is such a clear picture in my mind of trying on my own efforts to make myself right with God is the illustration of someone standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon, thinking that they can jump across it. It's the most ludicrous, silly attempt at achieving something, to think that you could jump 30 miles across the Grand Canyon. That is a beautiful and very laughable but perfect illustration of man-made attempts to get right with God. We can't do it any more than we can jump across the Grand Canyon. And then let's go back to our passage, and I'm going to read starting at verse 17 through 21 in the English Standard Version. "But if in our endeavor to be justified in Christ we too were found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin?" Hang on, I'm just going to stop right there because that is a troubling verse there, and I don't want it to get lost. How in the world would someone think of Christ being a servant of sin? So let me read it in the Message. "Have some of you noticed that we are not yet perfect? No great surprise, right? And are you ready to make the accusation that since people like me, who go through Christ in order to get things right with God, aren't perfectly virtuous, Christ must therefore be an accessory to sin, right? No, the accusation is frivolous." So what he's saying here is that there are people out there who see someone calling themselves a Christian, and then they sin, and they say, well, you're a hypocrite. But also, in addition to being called a hypocrite, some people would even say, well, it's by grace, and so just let it go. Don't worry about sin. Jesus died for that, so don't even worry about it. Christ is an accessory. He gave us liberty, and so just go ahead and live like you want to. Well, that is not at all what Paul is saying. The thought I want to just interject another thought here. This is from Warren Wiersbe's Warren Wiersbe's commentary. He says, before we criticize Peter, perhaps we had better examine our own lives to see how many familiar Bible doctrines we are actually obeying. As you examine church history, we see that even with a complete Bible, believers through the years have been slow to believe and practice the truths of the Christian faith. When we think of the persecution and discrimination that have been practiced in the name of Christ, it embarrasses us. It is one thing for us to defend a doctrine in a church meeting, and quite something else to put it into practice in everyday life. So I think Wiersbe is in agreement that it is definitely something that is clearly being explained here in Galatians, that we're not perfect, and for any of us, including Paul, to jump on Peter when we know we ourselves are guilty of some of the same things is kind of silly. And I do think that Paul, that's what he's doing here, is saying none of us is perfect. Let's see. I'm going to go on to verse 18. Verse 18 says, "For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor." In the Message, it says, "If I was trying to be good, I would be rebuilding the same old barn that I tore down. I would be acting as a charlatan." Here Paul is referring to the tendency we have to truly agree that one can only come to salvation through the free grace gift offered through Jesus' blood. But in real life, the day-to-day experiences we live in, we still tend to think we owe God something. We need to do certain things to keep current on our payments, so to speak. But what Paul is saying is either salvation is free from start to finish, or it isn't free at all. It isn't just that we accepted the offer of salvation, a free offer of salvation, and understood that it was free, but then went ahead and lived a life of some kind of obligation that steps outside of the whole concept of grace. Obligation and grace those two words can't be used in the same sentence. But often as believers, we kind of come up with some form of our sanctification, our growth in Christ. We come up with some concept of, we've got to pay it back. Now, Paul is going to make it very clear in Galatians that we will, out of love and gratitude, we will respond to the words of Jesus, the commands of Jesus in obedience. There's nothing in Galatians that suggests that we don't give our heart and our body over to the control of Jesus Christ. At the same time, though, we see that as just a love response, not as some kind of obligation that is going to keep us right with God. Yes, I was made right with God through grace, but I've got to do certain things to stay in His good graces. See, I mean, it's like those words again don't fit in the same sentence. So we're going to be careful that we don't slip back into a no grace walk with God. Grace definitely for my salvation, but what about after I become a Christian? What then? And so that is going to be a very big part of the rest of the book of Galatians. And I love that in the message, Paul says, I would be rebuilding the same old barn that I tore down. I would be acting as a charlatan. So that's a really good way to express it. Verse 19 in the ESV says, for through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. And then the message says, what actually took place is this. I tried keeping rules and working my head off to please God, and it didn't work. So I quit being a lawman so that I could be God's man. Now here is probably one of the most famous verses in the book of Galatians. And I mean, really, it's one of the most famous verses in the New Testament. Verse 20 and 21. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. Very powerful words. Let me read it to you from the Message. Christ's life showed me how and enabled me to do it. I identified myself completely with him. Indeed, I have been crucified with Christ. My ego is no longer central. It is no longer important that I appear righteous before you or have your good opinion, and I am no longer driven to impress God. Christ lives in me. The life you see me living is not mine, but it is lived by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I'm not going back. I'm not going to go back on that. Is it not clear to you that to go back to that old rule-keeping, peer-pleasing religion would be an abandonment of everything personal and free in my relationship with God? I refuse to do that, to repudiate God's grace. If a living relationship with God could come by rule-keeping, then Christ died unnecessarily. You know, Martin Luther wrote, faith connects you so intimately with Christ that he and you become, as it were, one person. As such, you may boldly say, I am now one with Christ. Therefore, Christ's righteousness, victory, and life are mine. On the other hand, Christ may say, I am that big sinner. His sins and death are mine because he is joined to me and I to him. Isn't that a bold statement by Martin Luther? And I think that's exactly what Paul is saying here when he says that the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. You know, he's not, I mean, by using the word flesh there, he's not talking about sin. He's just talking about that we still live in these bodies that have a sin nature, but I'm going to live it by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I think it's also very, very critical that we look at the end of verse 21. He says, I do not nullify the grace of God. And by saying nullify the grace of God, he's saying, I'm not ignoring God's grace. I'm not going to do that. Because if my righteousness could come through circumcision or through kosher or through not drinking and not dancing and not going to movies or whatever law that maybe you have tacked on. He says it nullifies God's grace, and Christ died for no purpose. Christ died unnecessarily. Now, ladies, let's just think about that for a second. When Jesus was in the garden just before he was arrested and later crucified, what did he pray? He said, Father, is there any other way? Is it necessary that I die to accomplish the salvation of people from their sins? I mean, I know it's an incredible plan, Father, that it was born out of incredible love and grace for mankind. But do I really have to die on the cross? Can't the rule keeping could we just keep doing that? And the Father simply said, no, there's no other way. There is no other way by which man may come into salvation, into right standing, into justification with God the Father, but through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross. There's no other way. And for us to try to add rules to our relationship with Christ is saying the cross isn't enough. It's the cross plus my effort. And that would make both the Father and the Son very, very sad. We want to maintain the purity of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that our salvation, our sanctification, our glorification, that every single moment from the time we invite Christ in is walked by grace, by faith, by grace in Jesus Christ, not our own works. Thank you for listening, ladies, and I will be back with you next week.